The last thing the Dreven trade minister did before leaving Earth was laugh. Not a quiet laugh, not a polite one. He laughed the way someone laughs when they see a child holding a toy sword and calling it a weapon. He laughed at the rows of aging human cruisers docked above the planet, at the slow rotation of their outdated shield arrays, at the human officers who stood proud and straight as if those rusting hulls meant something. He laughed the whole way back to the shuttle, and his aides laughed with him, because that is what you do when the species sitting across the table from you is simply no threat. The report he filed with the Galactic Council 3 days later was blunt. Humanity had one fleet, a visible, trackable, thoroughly documented fleet of 41 warships called the Sentinel Fleet. Their largest vessel, the carrier named Resolute, was older than most of the council delegates sitting in the chamber. Their weapons were 2 generations behind Dreven's standard. Their engines burned slower fuel. Their crew numbers were decent, but their coordination in battle simulations was rated average, at best. The council accepted the report, filed it, moved on. The Halden Belt dispute had been simmering for 2 years by then. The belt was a dense ring of asteroid clusters stretching across a contested star system, and underneath, the rock and ice were deposits of meridite ore, which was the rarest fuel compound in the known galaxy. Whoever held the Halden Belt effectively held a pricing lever over half the Council's member species. Earth had filed a territorial claim based on an old exploration treaty. The Drevens had counterfiled, backed by 3 Council allies and a legal team that had buried human diplomats in paperwork for 18 months. Ambassador Daniel Hale had sat through all of it, quiet, patient, taking notes. He was a thin man with gray at his temples and eyes that did not blink very often. He had been Earth's top diplomat for 11 years and had a reputation for being difficult to read. Council members called him Cold Hale behind his back. He did not seem to mind. When the Dreven delegation formally requested that Earth withdraw from the Halden Belt and surrender its equipment there within 30 days or face a military enforcement action, Hale looked at the lead Dreven delegate for a long moment and then said 2 words. "We decline." The chamber went quiet. A Dreven aide leaned over and whispered something to the lead delegate, probably asking if the translator had made an error. It had not. Hale gathered his papers and left. Back on Earth, Fleet Admiral Rebecca Voss received her orders. She was a broad-shouldered woman who had spent 30 years in uniform and had fought in 2 border skirmishes that the history books called minor and she called educational. She read the orders twice, then called her senior staff into the briefing room aboard the Resolute and told them what was coming. The Sentinel Fleet would move to the Halden Belt. They would take position, and if the Drevens came, they would fight. Her officers nodded. Some of them looked worried. A few looked calm. One of them, a young navigation officer named Petra Solis, asked a quiet question. "Is it enough, Admiral?" Voss looked at her for a moment. Then she said something that did not make sense to Petra at the time. "It does not have to be." What no one outside a sealed list of 7 people knew was that the Sentinel Fleet was never the real answer. It had not been designed to win. It had been designed to be seen. For 20 years, while Earth played the role of a modest, cooperative, slightly behind-the-curve member of the Galactic Council, a second project had been running in deep space, far from trade lanes and council sensor grids, in places no one looked because there was nothing there worth looking at. Dead moons with hollow cores, asteroid fields dense enough to scatter long-range scans, a debris cloud left over from a collapsed star that scrambled every frequency the Council used for surveillance. These were Earth's shipyards now, and they had been busy. The project had no official name in any record that could be accessed without 3 separate clearance levels and a physical key held by the President of Earth herself. Informally, the people who built it called it the Reserve. The person who commanded it had a different name for it. Commander Aidan Wright called it the Answer. He was not a tall man or a loud one. He had short, dark hair and a habit of standing very still when he was thinking hard, which his crew had learned to read as a warning sign. He had been selected for the reserve command 8 years ago after a panel review that lasted 6 days and involved psychological testing that he later described as deeply strange. He had never commanded a battle. He had spent 8 years training for one specific moment that he had always assumed would eventually come. When the encrypted message from Fleet Admiral Voss reached him, 2 days after Hale walked out of the council chamber, Wright read it once and then called his bridge crew to stations. He did not make a speech. He did not give a dramatic address over the ship-wide comm. He simply told his crew to begin pre-jump calculations for the Halden Belt staging coordinates and to run a full readiness check on every vessel in the formation. There were 112 of them. No one in the council knew that number. No one in the Dreven fleet knew it either. And that was exactly the point. There is a particular kind of silence that lives inside a ship that has never fired a shot in anger. It is not peace. It is pressure. Every drill, every practice run, every simulation sitting compressed inside the hull like a held breath, waiting. Commander Aidan Wright had lived inside that silence for 8 years. The reserve fleet moved through deep space in tight formation, running dark. No active sensors, no outward transmissions. Navigation was handled through preloaded charts and passive instruments that left no signal footprint. To any sensor grid they might drift past, they were nothing. A gap in space where light traveled and nothing else did. Wright walked the corridors of his flagship, a long angular vessel painted in sensor-absorbing matte that reflected almost no light. His crew called her the Gray Lady. She was fast. She was quiet. She carried weapons that the Council had never catalogued because the Council did not know she existed. None of them did. Not one of the 112 ships had ever appeared on a Council registry. The trick Wright had learned was not building the ships. That was just engineering and time. The real trick was building them without anyone noticing. And for that, humanity had used a very simple method. It had made itself boring. For 2 decades, Earth had been the most predictably uninteresting member of the Galactic Council. They paid their fees on time. They sent diplomats to every meeting, even the tedious ones about trade tariff sub-clauses. They submitted military transparency reports every 6 months listing their ships, weapons ratings, and patrol routes. All accurate, all perfectly boring, all describing only the Sentinel fleet. While Council observers watched the Sentinel fleet conduct routine drills in well-lit space, the reserve shipyards hummed quietly in the dark. The ore for the hulls had come through a network of small independent haulers, none large enough to attract attention, spread across so many shipping lanes that no single analyst would ever see the pattern. Engineers were recruited one at a time, through a program that technically did not exist in any government database. Families of crew members received cover stories about deep space research postings. People believed them because people generally do not assume the scale of what they cannot see. Wright stopped in front of a viewport and looked out at the formation behind him. He could see the running lights of the nearest ships, dim and green, the only concession to navigation safety they allowed themselves out here. The rest of the fleet was invisible, spread wide enough to avoid collision, close enough to respond in seconds. 112 ships. 64 destroyers, faster and more maneuverable than anything the Drevens had. 22 heavy cruisers built around a new shielding design that scattered incoming fire in ways standard targeting systems could not compensate for. 14 carriers loaded with strike craft. 8 long-range rail platforms that could hit a target from distances so far outside normal engagement range that an enemy would not know they were being targeted until the shot arrived. And the Gray Lady herself, which had taken 4 years to build and which Wright still was not sure was finished, because the engineers kept finding ways to make her better. He pulled up the mission brief on his wrist panel. The Halden Belt, the Sentinel fleet was already there, waiting. Admiral Voss would be running her delaying action soon, absorbing hits, making the Drevens feel confident. It was a hard thing to ask of a fleet, to go out and look like they were losing on purpose, to take real damage while pretending real desperation. Wright had thought about that a lot. He respected Voss for accepting those orders without argument. He also knew that if his fleet failed to arrive in time, Voss's ships would not be pretending anything. He called his tactical officer, a sharp-eyed woman named Una Reyes, who handled the fleet's coordination networks and had a gift for managing multiple battle tracks at once. "How long to the staging point?" he asked. 14 hours at current speed, she said. 11 if we push the drives. Pushing the drives meant slightly more heat signature, but 11 hours meant Voss's fleet spent fewer hours taking hits. "Push the drives," he said. "Keep the formation tight." Reyes nodded and turned back to her console. Elsewhere in council space, in a long chamber kept at the preferred temperature of 6 different species, Fleet Admiral Torven Kess was being congratulated on his pre-battle speech by no fewer than 4 council aides. He had described the coming action as a surgical correction of human overreach. He had called the Sentinel fleet a display of ambition unsupported by capability. He had promised the council the matter would be resolved quickly, professionally, and with minimum disruption to Meridite ore pricing. The council had applauded. The observers assigned to monitor the battle had boarded their neutral vessel and departed for the Halden Belt. Nobody in that chamber had asked one very simple question. Why was Hale so calm when he left? Nobody had thought to ask it, which was, of course, exactly what Hale had been counting on. The first Dreven missile hit the Resolute on her port side and knocked out 2 secondary shield generators and a water recycling unit that nobody had time to care about. Fleet Admiral Voss gripped the railing of her command platform and did not move. Around her, bridge officers called out damage readings and reallocation requests, their voices quick and controlled, the way voices get when people have trained hard enough that fear and habit are running at the same time. The Dreven fleet had arrived 4 hours ago, 37 warships, arranged in a wedge formation that Admiral Kess apparently favored, because every intelligence file Earth had on him mentioned it. The wedge was a pressure tactic: push into the enemy's center, force a split, then fold around both halves and compress. It worked very well against opponents who panicked. Voss was not panicking. She was calculating. She needed to hold the Dreven fleet here, in this belt, inside this engagement, for approximately 9 more hours. She needed to do it without losing so many ships that it stopped looking like a real fight and started looking like a slaughter. She needed the Drevens to stay confident but not reckless, aggressive but not fast enough to end things before Wright arrived. It was the most specific kind of difficult she had ever encountered in 30 years of service. She had, before the fleet left Earth, spent 6 hours with a team of behavioral analysts going over every recorded battle decision Torven Kess had ever made. He was vain. He was competent, but he was the kind of competent that knows it is competent and stops asking questions because of it. He would push when he was winning. He would slow down when his losses started climbing. He would not retreat because his record showed he had never retreated, and his ego was large enough to consider that a point of pride rather than a data gap. He needed to believe he was winning. Voss ordered the Sentinel fleet to begin a fighting withdrawal. Not a rout, not a collapse, a careful, grudging, step-by-step retreat that gave ground slowly and hurt the Drevens every time they took it. Her destroyer wing pulled back toward the dense asteroid clusters on the belt's eastern edge. Her cruisers formed a loose rearguard line and traded fire in short, controlled exchanges before pulling back as well. The Resolute herself took 2 more hits that looked worse than they were, smoke venting dramatically into space from a compartment that her chief engineer had quietly pre-selected for that purpose. Aboard the Council observer vessel, A Velthari analyst named Oren was watching the battle feeds and sending summaries back to the chamber. His report at Hour 2 read, "Human fleet retreating in good order but taking significant damage. Dreven forces making steady progress. Estimated human fleet combat effectiveness at 60% and declining." He was not wrong about the damage. He was wrong about everything else. The Dreven destroyer cutting reach pushed ahead of the main formation to press the retreating human line, which was exactly what Voss had expected. She had left a gap in the human rearguard, a tempting opening, and Kess had sent his fastest ship through it. Voss waited until the cutting reach was fully committed, then closed the gap with two cruisers moving at angles that should have been impossible for ships that old. The cutting reach lost her engine array. She drifted, not destroyed but mission dead. Kess slowed his advance by 30 minutes while rescue tugs retrieved her crew. That was 30 minutes right, did not have to cover. Voss kept her face steady and her orders quiet. She had people on this fleet who were going to get hurt today. Some already had. Damage reports were coming in with names attached, the way they always did, and she read every name and she kept moving because stopping was not an option she had. Hour 5. The Sentinel fleet had lost 4 ships, not catastrophically, not quickly. One at a time in exchanges that looked desperate in moments when the Dreven guns hit something critical and a human crew was gone. Voss logged each one. She would read the names again later properly. Right now she needed to know how many hits the rest of her fleet could absorb before the plan fell apart. Her tactical officer, a veteran named Dorn Alves, put up a quiet estimate without being asked. 7 more hours at current loss rate before fleet combat effectiveness drops to a point where withdrawal becomes the only rational option. Wright needed 9 hours, they had 5. She called Dorn over and spoke to him quietly enough that only he could hear. "I need the Drevens to slow down for 2 hours," she said, without it looking like they slowed down. Dorn thought about it. He pulled up the belt's geological charts. He pointed to a region of the belt where the asteroid density spiked sharply, a tangled mess of rock that navigation would need to pick through carefully. "If we pull back into that zone," he said, "they follow us in but they can't maintain formation speed. The rocks do the slowing for us. And if we're trapped in there when Wright arrives, then the rocks slow them down too, and Wright hits them from behind while they're still untangling." Voss looked at the chart for 3 seconds. "Do it." The Sentinel fleet turned and moved into the dense rock field, and the Drevens, confident, winning, followed. 9 light minutes away, in the dark beyond the belt's outer edge, 112 ships were dropping out of their transit burn, running silent, watching the battle feeds and waiting for the signal. Wright stood at the front of his bridge, very still, watching the timer count down. "Come on, Voss," he said quietly. "Hold a little longer." The signal was a single encoded pulse, 12 characters long, sent on a frequency no council member species monitored, because it fell between 2 bands both sides had independently decided were too narrow to be useful. Humans had decided otherwise. Wright received it at 14:32 Belt Standard Time. He read it. He turned to Reyes and said one word. "Now." What happened in the next 4 minutes would later be described in Council intelligence briefings as an anomalous tactical event. That was the language analysts use when something happened that they did not believe was possible and are still trying to understand. The reserve fleet did not simply arrive. The 64 destroyers came out of transit burn in 2 curved lines that swept around the eastern and western edges of the belt simultaneously, cutting off Dreven retreat vectors before Dreven sensor operators finished processing what they were seeing. The 22 heavy cruisers dropped in behind the destroyer screen, already at combat velocity, shields at full. The 8 rail platforms held position at extreme range, invisible, beginning targeting calculations, with the patience of systems that did not need to hurry. Then the Gray Lady came through the center. She came through at a speed that Dreven navigation models would later determine was technically inadvisable for a ship of her mass inside an asteroid belt. She came through threading gaps between rocks with precision that suggested sensors refined enough to map a debris field in real time at transit speed. By the time Dreven's systems resolved her into a coherent contact, the Gray Lady was already inside their formation perimeter. Wright watched the tactical display light up like water finding its level. Dreven contacts ringed on multiple sides. He watched Admiral Kess's flagship adjust heading 3 times in the first 90 seconds, which told him Kess was reacting on instinct rather than plan. Exactly what Wright wanted. A commander with a plan takes time to abandon it. Kess had none. Reyes called out contacts as they resolved. 3 Dreven cruisers turning to face us, she said, which was the critical part. Turning to face the reserve fleet meant turning their weaker flank toward the Sentinel fleet. Voss saw it immediately. Her battle-damaged, supposedly half-broken fleet came out of the rock field the moment the Drevens turned their attention elsewhere. Her cruisers fired across the gap at exposed Dreven flanks. Her destroyers, which had been conserving fuel for this moment, went a full burn and drove at the Dreven rear. The cutting Reach, limping under tug escort, found herself flanked by destroyers moving too fast to track and surrendered without firing a second shot. The Dreven frigate Steadfast Arrow crossed into rail platform range at exactly the wrong moment. The shot came from so far that her crew had no warning, no alert, no time. One moment she was maneuvering to support Kess's flagship. The next her engine section was gone. The rail platforms fired twice more in the next 8 minutes. Both hits. Both from beyond any distance the Drevens considered a realistic engagement range. Aboard the Council observer vessel, the analyst Oren was no longer writing summaries. He stood at his sensor display with his mouth open, watching contacts multiply on a screen that had been certain, 3 minutes ago, of only 41 human ships. The count was now 112. He counted again, then a third time, because the alternative was accepting that everything he had reported to the Council for 5 hours was built on a completely false picture. He sent a new message, much shorter than his previous ones. Human Second Fleet confirmed. Size and capability significantly underestimated. Battle outcome no longer favorable for Dreven forces. Requesting guidance. The Council chamber received it at a bad time. Kess's pre-battle speech was still being discussed warmly. Someone had proposed a minor award for his expected decisive action. The message landed into that conversation like a stone through glass. In the belt, Kess tried to reorganize. He was good at his job. He pulled 4 cruisers into a coherent defensive formation and blunted 1 destroyer charge. He landed fire on 2 of Wright's ships and damaged 1 badly enough to force her out of the fight. He was not simply falling apart. He was fighting. But he was fighting 1 fleet when he had planned for 1, and there were 2. Voss drove from one side. Wright drove from the other. The rail platforms continued their methodical work from the edge of the system. The carriers had launched strike craft, which added beautifully to the chaos of a formation already fractured. At 15:09, Kess sent a message to the Council flagged Priority 1, requesting permission to withdraw. The Council, still reading Oren's message in stunned silence, did not answer quickly enough. At 15:14, Kess stopped waiting and gave the order himself. It was the right call. It was also too late for 8 of his ships, which were too deep in the formation to get out cleanly. They surrendered 1 at a time. Wright watched the tactical board as the Dreven fleet broke apart and pulled back. He stood very still and watched until the last Dreven contact faded from the display. Then he asked Reyes for a damage report on every ship in the reserve fleet. 6 damaged, she said. 1 mission killed, no total losses. He nodded. He thought about the Sentinel fleets dead and did not say what he was thinking. He sent a short message to Voss. Good fight, Admiral. You held longer than you needed to. Her reply came back in under a minute. We always do. The Galactic Council had not held an emergency session at this hour in 11 years. The last time had been a supernova threatening a populated system. The species who called this session believed what they were dealing with was comparable. The chamber filled with delegates from 41 member worlds, some physically present, others projected as holograms with the slightly flat quality that long-distance transmission always introduced. Council Speaker Oran Des opened the session by reading Oran's full field report aloud. He read every line, including the part about rail platforms firing from distances outside Dreven engagement doctrine, and including the line where Oran wrote that the secondary human fleet appeared to be operating at a meaningfully higher technological standard than the primary fleet. When he finished, the chamber was quiet for a moment. Then everyone spoke at once. The Dreven delegation demanded a formal censure of Earth for concealing military assets. The Borantine delegation, who held 2 active trade agreements with Earth, argued that nothing in the Charter required any member to disclose the full extent of their military capacity. The Yanari delegation called for an independent audit of all human military installations. A smaller species called the Soli, who had been attacked by the Drevens 14 years ago and still remembered it, said nothing publicly. Their delegate was observed smiling. Speaker Des let the noise run for 4 minutes. Then he tapped his control surface 3 times, activating the tone that indicated order was required, and the chamber slowly settled. Ambassador Daniel Hale had arrived punctually. He sat with his hands folded on the table and waited through the full 4 minutes without moving. Des gave him the floor. Hale stood. He said first that Earth regretted the loss of life on both sides. He said it plainly and without the diplomatic softening that usually wrapped such statements. He meant it as a factual statement, and his tone made that clear. Then he said Earth had violated no treaty provision. He pulled up the relevant charter sections on the shared display and walked through them line by line. Military disclosure requirements applied to vessels actively deployed in Council-monitored space. The reserve fleet had operated exclusively in unclaimed deep space. It had never entered a monitored zone. It had never been detected because it had never done anything that required detection. It was, he said, simply a fleet that existed somewhere the Council had not looked. The Dreven lead delegate, Provisional Secretary Barak, said that this was deception by any reasonable standard. Hale asked him politely to point to the clause in the charter that prohibited it. Barak did not point to a clause. There was no clause. Everyone in the chamber knew there was no clause. The silence that followed was the kind that arrives when a room full of people all reach the same uncomfortable conclusion at once. Hale then set his notes aside and spoke without them. He said Earth had joined the Galactic Council 30 years ago as a new species unfamiliar with the customs and power structures of galactic politics. In those 30 years, Earth had been sanctioned twice for territorial claims later ruled legitimate, blocked from 3 resource agreements by voting blocs whose interests conflicted with human expansion, and denied a Security Committee seat 4 separate times despite meeting every published requirement. Earth had learned from those experiences that cooperation and goodwill alone did not protect a species. Earth had made decisions accordingly. He said he would take no further questions on the subject of the reserve fleet. He sat down. The Yanari delegate immediately called for a vote on an emergency military review of Earth's capabilities. The motion failed. The Borantine and Soli delegations voted against it. 6 smaller species who had never voted in bloc with those 2 before also voted against it. Des noted the result and moved to the Halden Belt dispute. That resolution took 40 minutes. Earth's claim was upheld. The legal basis had not changed. Only the political calculation had. Several delegates who had been prepared to vote against the human claim quietly reversed their positions during the recess. Nobody stated their reasons. Nobody needed to. Outside the chamber, in a corridor with an atmospheric mix close to Earth standard, Hale was met by his aide, a young man named Gil Eris, who had been with him 3 years, and was still learning that the best time to ask the ambassador how he was feeling was rarely right after a session. Gil asked him anyway. Hale was quiet for a moment. He said, "I used to think the goal was to be trusted by them." Gil waited. "Now I think the goal is to be respected. Those are not the same thing, but respect will do." He put his jacket on and walked toward the exit. Behind him in the chamber, 41 species were reconsidering many things about the quiet, polite, slightly behind-the-curve species they had spent 30 years barely noticing. Some of them, particularly the smaller ones who had spent decades afraid of larger powers, and who had watched Hale dismantle the Dreven motion without raising his voice, were reconsidering whether they had been paying attention to the wrong species all along. The Soli delegate sent a private communication to Earth's embassy before he left the building. It was brief and not officially logged. It said, "We would like to talk when you have time." Hale's aide received it, read it, and marked it as a priority follow-up. He was learning. 6 months after the Halden Belt, the galaxy had changed in ways that were difficult to measure but easy to feel. Trade routes that had previously excluded human carriers began reopening quietly, with terms considerably more favorable than the old ones. 3 species that had never formally engaged with Earth sent diplomatic inquiries. 2 of them were small, nervous species who had spent decades trying to stay invisible in council politics. Their messages were careful and coded and said essentially the same thing. "We noticed what happened. We would like to talk." The Dreven government sent no messages. They were occupied with an internal review of their military intelligence division, which had, as one Dreven media outlet put it with unusual bluntness, completely failed to see an entire fleet. Admiral Kess had been removed from command within a week. He gave a public statement that was professional and took full responsibility. Voss read it and privately respected him for it, even if she said nothing publicly. Voss was back on Earth. The Sentinel fleet had returned to dock for repairs. The 4 ships they had lost were being replaced. The names of the crews were now on a wall in the Fleet Memorial Building in the capital, alongside the names from every other engagement Earth had fought since first contact. She visited on a Wednesday morning when no one else was there, and stood in front of the wall for a while. She was not the kind of person who said much in moments like that. She believed the names deserved silence more than words. Wright had a different kind of quiet waiting for him. The reserve fleet had returned to its deep space positions. The Council knew it existed now. There was no point pretending otherwise. But knowing it existed was not the same as knowing where it was or what it was fully capable of. During the battle, the rail platforms had operated at the extreme edge of sensor range. Oren's report described their effect accurately, but their position only approximately. That margin, Wright thought, was worth keeping. He wrote a full after-action report for President Ford. It was long. He included everything that had not gone perfectly, because a report that only listed successes was not a report. He included the timing problem in the 3rd hour of transit that had pushed his arrival 15 minutes late. He included the destroyer squadron that had briefly lost formation in the asteroid field and needed 3 minutes to reform. He sent the report and then did something he had not done in 8 years. He took 2 weeks of leave. He went to a place on Earth's coast where the ocean was cold and the rocks were flat, and you could sit for hours hearing nothing except water. He sat there for most of the first week. He thought about his sister, who had 3 children he barely knew because he had been in deep space for most of their lives. He thought about a book he had been meaning to read for 4 years. He thought about the crews of the 4 Sentinel ships and whether they had known, in the moments before they were gone, that the plan was working. He decided they probably had. Voss would not have kept that from them. On the last day of his second week, a message arrived from President Ford. It was marked personal correspondence, not official. Her way of saying it was honest. She thanked him. She said the Council had ratified Earth's Halden Belt claim and that Maridite ore shipments were already being scheduled. She said 2 new species had formally requested trade partnerships this week. One of them, a species with a technology that Earth's engineers had been trying to develop for a decade without success. Then she said she had a request. She needed him to report to the shipyard coordinator on Titan when his leave ended. There was a new project, no official name yet. She had ideas about what it might become, but she wanted his input before anything was decided. It would be, she wrote, larger than the reserve fleet. Wright read that line twice. He looked out at the ocean for a moment. He thought about the Dreven trade minister laughing on his way back to the shuttle. He thought about the council chamber and 41 species who were now, somewhere, trying to understand what they did not know about humanity. He thought about what it meant that the answer to that question would keep growing, and the council would keep not knowing. He wrote back. His reply was 4 words. I will be there. He put his comm unit away. He sat on the flat rock for another hour listening to the water. The sun moved. The tide changed. A bird he did not recognize landed near him, looked at him with one eye, decided he was uninteresting, and flew away. He took that as a good sign. Far above, beyond the atmosphere and the orbit of the moon and the mapped edges of the solar system, in the deep space between stars where sensor grids showed nothing and council charts listed only empty distance, the new shipyards were already being surveyed. Nobody was watching, nobody knew where to look. And somewhere in that same dark, a species that had been laughed at 30 years ago was building something that nobody in the council had a name for yet, and had no plans whatsoever to give them one. The galaxy thought it had seen what humanity was. It had seen what humanity was willing to show. Those were not the same thing. They never had been. And the distance between them, measured in hulls and drives and weapon systems being assembled in the silence between stars, was growing larger every day.